Today we're diving into a really dramatic couple of decades in psychology. We're talking about the period from 1920 to 1940. This was a wild time of invention, crisis, and straight-up revolution that completely changed how we even think about measuring the human mind. And it all kicked off with one single, massive question.
It really does all start here. How do you measure a personality? I mean, think about that. How do you take something so complex, so internal, so human, and turn it into cold, hard data? 100 years ago, this was the monumental puzzle that psychologists were desperately trying to solve.
Right, because before you can even begin to measure something invisible, you have to agree on what it is you're actually looking for.
So the big idea they landed on was this concept of a personality trait. You can think of a trait as just a stable characteristic that kind of makes you, well, you. For instance, are you generally an optimist, someone who sees the bright side no matter what? Or are you more of a pessimist who tends to see the potential problems first? These are the kinds of enduring tendencies that those early tests wanted to measure.
So, what was their first shot at actually doing this? Well, you might be surprised. The first major breakthrough wasn't born in some quiet, sterile university lab. Nope, it was forged in the absolute chaos of a world at war.
That's right. The first big personality tests were created out of pure necessity. During World War I, the military had this huge problem. They needed a fast, efficient way to screen thousands and thousands of recruits for potential psychological issues. They needed a tool, and they needed it yesterday.
And this was the solution they came up with, the structured test. We're talking simple, old-school paper and pencil questionnaires. Lots of true-false, maybe some multiple choice. The whole point was you could hand them out to huge groups of people at once and score them super easily. And the one that started it all was the Woodworth Personal Data Sheet.
Now here's where it gets really fascinating. The core assumption behind these tests was incredibly simple. They'd ask a very direct question, like this one, and they basically just took your answer at face value. If a recruit answered false to "I wet the bed," the testers just assumed, okay, this person does not wet the bed. Simple as that.
But, and this is a huge but, as logical as that sounds on the surface, that very assumption was about to plunge the entire field into a massive crisis.
So let me ask you, can you really always trust a direct answer to a very personal question, especially when the stakes are high, like, say, whether or not you get into the Army? Well, the scientific community started asking that exact same thing.
And they found some pretty major flaws in this face value approach. For one, people might just lie, right, to make themselves look better. But also, two different people might read the exact same question and interpret it in completely different ways. So that simple logical assumption, it just didn't hold up to scrutiny.
And oh boy, the backlash was severe. The criticism from other researchers got so intense that by the end of the 1930s, these structured tests, the ones once hailed as this huge breakthrough, were on the verge of being completely abandoned. It was this incredible dramatic rise and an equally dramatic fall.
But, out of the ashes of that crisis, a totally different philosophy started to emerge. It was a new approach that basically said, hey, if you can't trust a direct answer, maybe you shouldn't ask a direct question in the first place.
This was the game-changing idea. Instead of giving someone a clear question that has a clear answer, what if you showed them something unclear, something totally ambiguous, and just analyzed how they made sense of it? The theory was that the meaning a person projected on that stimulus had to come from their own personality, their own mind.
And of course, the most famous example of this is the Rorschach test, which first came out way back in 1921. You've all seen it, right? You get shown a weird, symmetrical ink blot, and you're asked this super open-ended question. What might this be? There's no right answer. It's all about your personal interpretation.
Then, a little later in 1935, you get the Thematic Apperception Test, or TAT for short. This one was a little more structured. It used ambiguous drawings of people in different situations. But the task was basically the same idea. Tell me a story about what's happening here. The goal was to uncover your hidden needs and motivations through the kinds of stories you'd tell.
Okay, so let's just pause and look at this. Because by the late 1930s, you've got these two completely opposite ways of thinking. On one side, you have structured tests. They have a clear stimulus, like a question, and a very specific response, like true or false, which is super easy to score objectively. But on the other hand, you have the projective tests with their ambiguous stimulus, a totally open-ended response, and scoring that was, well, let's just say it was very subjective.
And this just set the stage for an absolutely fascinating conflict. It was like a tale of two tests, two warring philosophies, each battling for the future of how we understand personality.
And this timeline really lets you see that 20-year revolution play out. Look, in the 1920s, it's all about the surge of structured tests like the Woodworth. But at the exact same time, the Rorschach gets quietly published over in Switzerland. It doesn't really catch on in the US until the early 30s. Then the TAT comes along and boom, by the end of the decade, the tables have completely flipped. Structured tests are on their way out, and projective tests are the hot new thing.
So as this whole period came to a close, the field of psychology was basically split right down the middle. It had two fundamentally different and totally competing answers to that original question of how to measure personality, and there was absolutely no resolution in sight.
And that really leaves us with a provocative final thought, doesn't it? If one method is built on answers that you can't really trust, and the other is built on interpretations that are incredibly difficult to prove scientifically, well, where does that leave us? This is the essential challenge that was born in that era, and honestly, it's a question we are still grappling with today. How do we ever truly measure who we really are?